there's this tweet I really love that says, debugging is like being the detective in a murder mystery where you're both the victim and the killer.
Machines are so fast and stores are so big that they give us plenty of latitude to screw things up.
The shell, which is the name we give to the command interpreter.
So the operator got a pair of tweezers and very carefully fished the moth out of the relay.
Because you all read the Mythical Man month.
And the best motivator in the world for programming is scratching your own itch.
Developers.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Sourcecraft podcast. My name is Byung, and today I'll be talking to Dan Bentley. Dan was an engineer at Google for over 10 years, where he worked on a variety of developer tools and infrastructure. He has since founded a company called Tilt that is bringing sanity back to developer environments in the age of microservices and Kubernetes. Smart rebuilds, live updates, an easy-to-use CLI, and a beautiful GUI dashboard for your multi-service dev environment. Plus a window into what it was like for an engineer at Google just before the IPO, features he misses from Google Code, and a precursor to Google's famed Blaze build system. Stay tuned. All right, I'm here with Dan Bentley, the very first full-time developer tools engineer at Google, and now CEO of Tilt, a tool for multi-service development environments. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, great to be here.
So to kick things off, can you tell us about how you first got into programming? What has been your journey from programming newbie all the way to, founding a developer tools company?
Yeah, so I had just an incredibly privileged background where my dad is a computer scientist. And so I started programming in college, but actually growing up, we'd talk about Big O or Quicksort over dinner. And so I think that really shaped how I thought. And so when I got to college, I took computer science classes and I learned how to program originally at first in C over winter break from the book, The C Programming Language by Kernahan and Ritchie, K&R. And as I took computer science classes, I realized that I was learning lots of interesting things, but it felt like my brain had kind of already been prepared or molded to think that way. So I actually went and was an English major for my undergrad degree. Yeah, because I was like, hey, this is really teaching me a new way to think as opposed to just kind of sponging up things that already fit into how my brain worked. And so I did that, and then I was very fortunate to get a job at Google as I was coming out of college in 2004. And so I showed up there, and I think we'll talk about this a little more in a bit. But yeah, I just kind of always thought, hey, I'm going to figure out what kind of product that really matters to end users I want to work on at some point. But until then, I'll just kind of do things that help other engineers. And I feel like my career has just kind of been a continuing descent into the bit mines, so to speak. And that's, kind of where I'm at now.
Awesome. And now you've started a company. It's called Tilt. It's a tool that makes it easier to develop multi-service applications, but in the development environment. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And in particular, how would you describe Tilt to an engineer who has never heard of it before?
Yeah. I think that Tilt is a tool that you might not realize you need because you can do everything you already do without it. It just requires you taking care of a lot of things that really should be someone else's problem. And so what we want is that when you come in, you're able to just run Tilt up, and then you have your whole app running. You can save a file, and the app will be updated, and you won't have to think about so much. And so in that sense, it's kind of like a build tool in that it goes from your code to your app. And I think, we can talk more about how it's more than a build tool, but really we want to let you focus on programming and let Tilt focus on what steps need to happen in your workflow for you to be able to solve the problems you have.
Got it. So it is kind of the pain that you're trying to solve, this pain that a lot of the developers have where, I want to go in, I want to write some code, try it out in my development environment, but, every time I save a file, if I want it to automatically rebuild and redeploy, I have to set that up manually. If there's like some test I want to run after making some change, I have to set that up manually. Is that kind of like that kind
Yep.
of, like write code, what do they call it? Write, test, deploy, that kind of loop, the thing that you're optimizing?
Yeah. Edit, compile, debug. It seems like lots of people have different names for the cycle, but they almost always have three pieces. There's this tweet I really love that says, debugging is like being the detective in a murder mystery where you're both the victim and the killer. And so we want to let you focus on figuring out why something's happening or how to fix it so that you can be the detective. We can be the CSI lab tech who's shaking the beakers at the right times so that you can really use all of your brain for the important stuff.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. There are a couple of, existing tools that fit into this that come to mind. On one end of the spectrum, there's, Make. There's things like, proc files, Foreman, things like that. How does Tilt fit into that picture? Is it a replacement for those tools or is it somehow adjacent?
I think it sits above them a little. Yeah. That you, for a tool like Make or Bazel, it's really thinking about how do I go from files to another file, a binary, or even a unit test output. Whereas Tilt's really about multi-service development, that now my app isn't just one binary. And for decades, it was the case that your app was one binary. Now it's all of these different services that you have to run. And so Make or even Docker build is about how you go from files to one binary or one image. Foreman or Docker Compose or Gorman is about how you start up a bunch of different things. Tilt's about how you start them up, how you keep them up, how you iterate on them. When you change one file, what's the fewest number of things and the fastest to get the right code running, but also the feedback. Hey, how do you go from there being 20 different services with 20 different logs to you knowing where a problem is? It's too easy in lots of cases to have to miss an error because it's flying by, or because they're all scattered throughout, to have to play 20 questions flipping between terminal tabs or log files just to see where a problem is. And so we want you to have a peripheral vision of having a UI that gives you a holistic sense. Tilt understands your app and helps you understand it across these different services.
That sounds awesome. It sounds really featureful. One question I have is, if a developer is trying out Tilt, what is it? What is it? Is it a CLI? Is it a GUI? Is it a config file format? Like what are the different things that one would have to set up and use in using Tilt?
Yeah. So the Tilt UI is in a web UI. So it's served on localhost. So Tilt is a single binary. You download it, you run Tilt up, and it opens a tab in your browser where you can see the Tilt UI. And Tilt's figuring out what to do based on a configuration in a Tilt file. So like Make file, but for Tilt. And in it, you tell Tilt about the different pieces of your app. Now that might be Kubernetes YAMLs and Docker builds and the port forwards you want. It might be because your dev isn't in Kubernetes that it's this process to run to compile and this other process to run the service for each of your n different services. So you configure it in a tilt file, which is a subset of Python, and you see it in your web browser. And I'm really proud that we make tilt respond to what you're doing as you do it. So as you change a file, tilt can recompile it, and you'll see it kick off in the browser. As you change the tilt file itself, tilt will re-execute the tilt file. So just from starting to set it up, you aren't dealing with this, well, let me change the file, then rerun the tool. Tilt's just always there, responding to the edits you're making in either your source code or the configuration itself.
Cool. And so diving into the GUI part, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, I've tried out the tool, and one of the things that really stuck out to me was this experience of being able to run multiple processes in my dev environment and then having this nice GUI interface to, kind of see the state and the logs of each process separately, as opposed to just dumping everything to standard out, which I think is kind of the, standard practice today in development.
Yeah, I think it is the standard practice, and it's what you can get when you're building a tool kind of in a hurry because you have a real product to deliver. For us, Tilt is our product, and we're excited to make it as functional and as beautiful as a consumer product. My co-founder, Nick, worked at Medium on their editor, which I think is pretty featureful and, well, maybe less featureful and more minimal and really focused. We want to be focused on development. And so standard out is great when you have one standard out, because when there's a problem, boom, the problem is the last thing in the log. Now that we have so many things, we just realized it was too easy to miss where the problem was. And so building a UI versus just dumping everything to standard out is an order of magnitude or more effort. But we think it's worth it in this new world where you have so many services to have that peripheral vision where you can see problems even if they're not the latest thing across the whole system, because you're able to slice and dice and dig into each service.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. It almost feels like the development environment is kind of this orphan in the overall developer experience. We have so many tools these days that have kind of made our lives easier in testing, in deployment, but the development environment is still like someone wrote a bunch of bash scripts and they kind of magically spin up the processes and it all dumps to standard out. And, God help you if you ever have to go in and debug anything in that piece of orchestration.
I mean, kind of what we say is that every team has a half-assed version of Tilt, whereas we're putting our whole ass into it. And we really think it's an improvement.
You mentioned something earlier that I want to dive into, which is that Tilt kind of knows, it's watching your files, so it knows when those files change, and it figures out somehow which processes need to be restarted. Can you go into how it does that? Is it something that you have to configure and set up, or is it something that's able to kind of infer magically?
Yeah. Tilt's able to figure it out in common cases. If you're using Docker build because you're using Kubernetes or Docker Compose, Tilt's able to figure that out from where the context goes. What we really want with Tilt is that simple setups that match best practices, or at least the introductory best practices, just work out of the box. But also that whatever your team does, even if it's not what we recommend you do, even if it's not what you're happy you're doing, we want you to be able to do it in Tilt because that's what you're doing, and you shouldn't have to change everything or throw it out just to start using Tilt. And so we can try and figure it out, but you can always tell us more about it. And if you find a situation where you can't, where it's too limited, please let us know, because we want to be adding more of those hooks for more complex projects.
That makes a lot of sense. So you've been, in talking about Tilt, you've been mentioning Docker and Kubernetes a lot, and totally makes sense because these are kind of the ways that, in modern service-oriented architectures or microservices architectures, you deploy applications. But what if, I don't use Docker in my development environment, or what if, I deploy many services, but I don't actually containerize them? Is Tilt still applicable in that case?
Yes, it certainly is. We are working on it, and we may still have some rough edges that we want to fix and that we'd love your feedback on how to fix. What we think is that there are smarts that are Kubernetes specific in Tilt, and that's maybe 20% of it. The other 80% is just dealing with, as soon as your app is more than one binary, how do you develop? And I think what we've really seen is that having more systems, like you mentioned, to operate multiple services has led more teams down that route. That as you have more CI/CD, more tracing and observability, and there's a lot of reasons to prefer multiple services. You can have different teams release on different schedules. But for development, there hasn't been the same kind of innovation and tools. And so I think kind of the ops tail has wagged the dev dog. That because we've been so able to do it in operations and in production and staging, we haven't done it in dev, that time from when you create a new branch until you have a pull request ready to go, where you want feedback in less than a second. You want your compiles or your unit tests to be super fast. That's where Tilt can fit in. And so absolutely, if you're just running processes because you have some shell script or some wiki page that tells you what different servers to start, absolutely Tilt can still work with that using a feature called local resource.
That's very cool. Your comment earlier about the ops tail wagging the dev dog, definitely strikes home. There's some developers I talk to who have just had enough of the whole, microservices trend and Docker and Kubernetes. What would you say to the folks who, say, we've gone too far, it's time to go back to monoliths? Most applications, especially if they're CRUD, can be run as a single binary. Do you think that they're completely off base, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think most teams that I talk to that say that, the more I dig in, the more it's not quite true. Yeah, we have a monolith, but we also have a database. We also have Redis. We also have this binary in Go for search, or that Elasticsearch. There's some exceptions that don't, to most people, you just set it up once and you don't think about it, but it hurts your onboarding. It hurts developers who do edit that code. It hurts when you try and make changes that don't fit into the monolith. And so I think people who say we should only run one are like, yes, you should only have one within the incentives that we've had. And so you should give Tilt or some of the other tools that I'm happy to mention too a try, because being able to do all of this, it's what we've had within the monolith, right? We've had libraries. You've been able to add functionality that you didn't write into your app by way of a library. And so Tilt is kind of taking that to a slightly higher level, which is why I say it kind of sits on top of a Make or a Bazel, to say now the way to add functionality isn't another library that you have to fit into a binary using some kind of weird FFI or like C, include something JNI. You can just say these are slightly different pieces and I can still develop with them without having to know them. to me, that's the key. The cost of having multiple services has been you've had to think about them, update them, debug them. If we can automate that, and so that to you it's something you don't think about, the same way you don't think about the libraries included in your binary until you're trying to improve them, well, then why do you care?
You're kind of saying that a lot of the people who want to go back to the monolith, it's because the monolith is kind of this established model, and the tools and practices were kind of mature around it. And the multi-service model is something that's newer to a lot of people, and it's going to be painful at first. But if we make that experience better, there's going to be more and more people opting for that for kind of the right reasons.
Yeah, if I think what I'm even saying is, if you can not feel the pain without giving up the benefits that attracted you to it, that's the best of both worlds. And so we're trying to reduce the pain you feel with Tilt.
Cool. So taking a step back a bit, can you tell us about how you got started on the road to Tilt? And, maybe go back all the way to when you first started your career. In conversations before, you mentioned that you were the first engineer inside Google working full-time on developer tools back in, kind of the 2004, 2005 time period. What was that like?
Yeah. When I joined Google, everyone had a day job of shipping some product, and there was this notion of intergrouplets. There was your group where you were doing your work and the intergrouplet. And so one was about documentation, one was about testing, one was about developer tools, and there were a bunch. And at that time, Google was realizing we need to actually invest in these things that are crucial to engineering, to actually staff them up with full-time engineers as the org was growing. And so I was working on developer tools, and I'll be honest, there was a cost to that of not working on production systems full-time means that you lose some of what the pains are day to day. You get this kind of stilted view. But I think that notion of there's your work doing app dev where you're actually programming what your users use that run in the data center versus being a developer experience engineer where you're working on the developer experience that every other developer has on their laptop, at the time desktop. It's really key to invest in as well at a certain size. It was amazing to see how quickly things were growing. It wasn't enough just to make, the build tool faster when the whole code base was growing so quickly that you had to not just make it faster at the rate that the code base was growing, but even faster than that in order to actually have users see an improvement. So it was stressful but exciting. I'm really fortunate, I think, to have been there at that time.
That's really fascinating because today Google, from an engineer's perspective, is known for having just this wonderful internal environment and all sorts of developer infrastructure that make them kind of best in class in software engineering. But what you're saying is, back in 2004, that wasn't yet the case. Is that right? It was all just kind of the informal grassroots, like these grouplets sprung out of what engineers felt was important, and they started working in their 20% time on. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the tools that you now think of as really great came about a bit later, maybe in the 2005 to 2010 timeframe.
That's fascinating. So were you around? So a couple of tools that I'm aware of, just because I did a brief stint at Google, and they've also talked publicly about these, are Google Code Search, which searches across almost all of Google's code base, and Critique, their code review tool. Were you around when these were first created?
I forget exactly dates, but certainly as they spread out. Code Search is amazing, and making that public led to a lot of Russ Cox's work on RE2, a great library for regular expressions, which is just fascinating to read about. But I think really the idea that you can just see everything in your scope is so important when you also had this notion of being able to change anything in your scope. That part of what made build so difficult at Google was you could go and build anything. You could change down to kind of the common libraries that had the hash map that you used. In most other places, you're using so much library code that you just consume as prepackaged executables or jar files. But at Google, you could really, change the RPC library, which you didn't need to that often, but when you did, you really did. Or when you were working on it, you could also go build the Gmail binary that was having the problem. And so it just gave you this freedom to understand things across your whole app, which I think is really, really powerful. So code search, yeah, amazing. And I'm sure you'd say so too, because you are dedicating a lot of effort. I think there's code search as well as deeper understanding of the code. At Google, that was called Grok, Grok, which has been open sourced. I forget the name of it now. Kythe, yes,
is the open source name.
There's a lot of different things of language server protocol that's trying to get at how do you make a UI that doesn't just let you search for tokens, but actually search for, just this function here where all the places it could have been defined because of inheritance. So that's even more than just the code search. That's some more understanding of it. Code review. I mean, I think some of the ways that you really want to do code review and interactions, Google was fantastic at. You can see it now in Gerrit, which is one open source tool that's similar. I think even GitHub pull requests still quite aren't at the level of, I want to switch between multiple different versions that were uploaded and how did the review progress, which is something that, again, I don't care about that often, but when I do, it's amazing.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's something I hear from a lot of people inside Google or who've worked at Google that, when they compare it to, publicly available tools like GitHub PRs, they really miss the internal code review tool that they had inside Google. What was so special about it?
Yeah, I think so one piece is going back and looking at it months later when you're trying to chase down a bug and you're trying to understand how did this happen. With Git and pull requests, we often squash and kind of lose the history of what were the intermediate steps. Whereas sometimes being able to really dig in to why did this change happen, if I just look at consecutive commits in the actual history, it seems like, you wouldn't do this. Well, hey, there's another, that's kind of the chapter by chapter, but the page by page of the code review, helping you understand how it happened can help you understand how to avoid it or where else it might be happening. Because you can understand that, hey, this was a long code review and this was getting kind of realized at the last minute in a smaller scope than you need to think about this larger or this issue of interaction between different systems. I think it helps you get empathy, frankly, to understand how things can occur.
So does it really come down to that kind of Git flow? Like with GitHub PRs, you're kind of pushing up to a branch, and because of that, you're often force pushing or squashing changes. Whereas with Gerrit or Google's internal tool, if I recall correctly, you're not really pushing to a branch at all. You kind of have this like fake head that you're pushing to, and then Gerrit kind of keeps track of like, oh, this is the first version of the patch said, oh, you pushed another, and then it is kind of smart enough. It's not just showing you the diff between the head commit of your branch and the base of master, but it's actually keeping track of like each subsequent revision you're pushing. Is that kind of the crux?
Yeah, I think just GitHub, frankly, has been amazing at getting more people to do open source development.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you go where your users are. Google's internal tools were built for what's it like to work on huge systems, with teams that are around, that you can count on people. I think a lot of what GitHub really got right was you can fire off a pull request, and if someone doesn't reply to it, it's no skin off your back because you have a fork. The flip side of it is they built things that really encouraged the simple cases to, get you more of a sense of community. I think they didn't have as much of that. What's it like, working 40 hours a week, working with so many code reviews at a time that you need more accountability, more dashboards, just to know what all of the different things in flight are. Maybe I'm missing stuff. It's still easy for me to miss all of the different pull requests that are in different repos on GitHub.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of the developer tools that you worked on directly at Google?
Yeah. I worked on a tool called Mach, M-A-C-H, because it was a build tool that was trying to be as fast as the speed of sound. Mach
Nice.
1 is the speed of sound. And that was for Java developers. And I'm really proud of some things I learned there in terms of toolsmithing, where it's easy to blame a tool for slowness if it's a black box. But what I realized is that lots of the reasons that Mach seemed slow was because of how people had configured their clients, and they weren't including enough code. And so this is a little trick of the trade. I just had the first time Mach was going to rebuild, say it's because of this file that changed. And that little change let people know, hey, I'm depending on that file. Why am I depending on that file? And I either go change it so they weren't depending on it, or kind of going and they knew what to do. They were able to take that and make some decision off it.
Yeah.
So that's one tool. I worked on another tool that did unit tests. I think today we'd call it CI, but that wasn't a huge term back in 2004. At the time, Google's nightly build was starting to take more than 24 hours, so it wasn't really nightly. I did it in parallel across a bunch of computers in the data center, and it would take 40 minutes. And that was technically super impressive. And I realized not as useful as it could have been, because it was too much focused on bandwidth across all of the system, all of the repo, as opposed to really answering questions people had about, hey, for what I'm working on, is it green or red? And so there was another effort internally that was more impactful that I really learned from. I ended up working on the open source team. How do you get a bunch of the great code that Google has made available in the world outside Google, and tried to figure that out. And for a while, it was kind of consulting with teams that wanted to open source. Later, made tools that helped you open source repeatedly. That led to Google Code, the project hosting on code.google.com, which...
Oh, wow. So were you kind of the instigator for Google Code?
Oh, no. Google Code, Chris DeBona and Brian Fitzpatrick and Ben Collins Sussman, the latter two were very involved with Subversion and Apache, and so they set that up. By the time I came to Google Code, it had been doing project hosting for years and had both Subversion and Mercurial support. I joined it in, 2011 or so. And I thought it was really great because at the time SourceForge was falling over, and it's important that open
Yeah.
source code has a place to live. And so Google Code supported, repos and big repos and had issue tracking, and a descendant of that issue tracker is still what Google Chrome uses for issue tracking today. So it really helped teams work on software. There were ways to copy stuff around, but it didn't encourage forking. And that's really what GitHub, I think, was just fantastic at, was saying fork isn't a 4-letter word. Up till then, it had been taking my toys and going over to this other place. It had been really a community dissolving, whereas GitHub was about how it makes the community stronger, that everyone can work together without having to ask permission all the time. Up till then, you kind of had committers, and they could do whatever, and non-project members were stuck waiting. And GitHub, with the abilities that Git offered, made a model of being able to do what you want, and that was fantastic.
Kind of comparing the two, Google Code, I used it heavily during my college years for things like, working on projects with friends and sharing code for assignments, group assignments. Comparing that to the GitHub experience, are there things that you like about one that you wish the other had?
I think there are specific things about the issue tracker, especially as they relate to privacy and being able to hide things, that were incredibly powerful.
This is in Google
in
Code?
Google Code, yeah. I mean, I think GitHub has just, done so much now that it's hard to remember exactly when they did what. I think GitHub still could be more focused on, teams where like you are working together and you kind of are sitting side by side, but you're also doing stuff on, for instance, an open source project where it kind of has that attitude of it's volunteer, and like, no, we're working together. Like, yeah, help me know that that I want more from tools. I joined Google Code. I think a lot of what I was excited about was getting more internal Google tools out into the world. And for various reasons, I don't think we did a great job of that. I'm excited that there are now companies, for instance, SourceGraph, that are trying to bring a lot of cool tools that massive companies have had internally to make it available to anyone who wants it.
Are there any other tools that you had inside Google that you sorely miss now?
Yeah, I think there's distributed build. It's always nice to have your build be faster. People kind of think about that, but to me, one sea change at Google that I saw was there was a tool called Sponge internally, and it had all of your builds and tests. And so the sea change was when you went to ask for help, you didn't just describe the problem. Hey, is anyone else seeing a problem with backend number 3? Instead, you'd say, here's a link that has the exact test failure and a lot of different context for it. And it just saved you from having to play this back and forth game of telephone, using a coworker as the world's kind of highest latency and most error prone shell to like give you data. You instead had all of that bundled up. I think that's a lot of what we're excited to do with the Tilt Cloud aspect of letting people share context, so that getting people unstuck and productive again is a matter of sharing a link, not a matter of trying to describe everything again. So I miss Sponge in that way.
That would actually be super cool. So what you're describing is, if I have some bug in development, instead of, copying a bunch of logs and, sending someone a chat message, I could just say, hey, here's the link to my development context and all the services are running. You have all the context that I have. Can you help me figure this out? Is that what you're
Yeah.
describing?
Yeah, in fact, it's just unfair, right? That like when you need help is kind of when you're often the least able to know what's helpful. So what we kind of already have and is coming out soon for Teams is this notion of a snapshot where when you're in Tilt, you can click a button to get a link that instead of being served off localhost that only you can see because it's running on your laptop, lives on cloud.tilt.dev and is the same Tilt UI that your team knows with exactly what you were seeing. And so you can just paste that link into Slack. So instead of saying, hey, is anyone else seeing import errors in the shopping cart service? Someone else on the team can just click that link, see the import error and what it is, and go, oh yeah, that's because Jeff merged a new change that changes, package.json, run this command or click this button in the Tilt UI and you'll be good to go.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to talk about build systems at Google without mentioning Blaze and its open source counterpart, Bazel or Bazel. Can you talk about how the tools that you've discussed so far, Mock, Sponge, how did those relate to Blaze?
So Mock was a predecessor to Blaze, and Blaze replaced it and is fantastic and has all kinds of distributed build goodies that Mock never had. Sponge was almost a backend for Blaze in that how do you know what test failures are? Well, it's whatever Blaze says a test failure is. And so one of Google's great strengths is just there was so much respect for the engineering leadership that the top-down decrees of you will use Blaze or you will use what became gRPC were all right because they were good decisions. And so there was so much commonality that you to build a thing like Sponge didn't have to build integrations with any individual build tool. You just built it into Blaze and it worked for everyone at Google. And so Blaze, I think is fantastic. I think that it is like the culmination of 40 years of development, starting with Make that Stu Feldman wrote, a kind of mildly complete version of in one weekend. And, it's gotten better and better. And now Blaze has had like millennia invested in it. And I think of it as like CERN, like it's a $15 billion particle accelerator of like smashing files like .c and .h files into the carbon atom of a library, smashing those to become like an iron atom of a binary, putting them together with others to become a uranium atom of a container image. I think, and it does it at huge scale and really effectively.
I guess it really lives up to its name, doesn't it?
Yeah. Whereas like Tilt, on the other hand, like we can't compete with Bazel in terms of doing that. We're kind of saying, hey, we take the different atoms that your build tool built, each for a different service, and we combine them into your app, which isn't one atom anymore. It's like a molecule. And so we're not a $15 billion particle accelerator. We're a $15 chemistry set where you can put these things together in a fundamentally different way, not by like building them or linking them together at compile time, but of making them one living, breathing, distributed system.
Yeah, before you can, test your grand experiment on, the world's largest particle accelerator, you got to go through many iterations with the home chemistry set, right?
Yeah.
So then do you think that, Bazel is the open source version of Blaze.
Mm-hmm.
And, one question people always have is, are they essentially the same or are there differences? And, if they are kind of the same thing, do you foresee that Bazel will eventually kind of take over the world? In like 5 years, 10 years, is everyone going to be using Bazel as their build system?
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. I think they are pretty much the same in terms of how you configure them, what they're able to do. I think one difference is that you probably don't have as much of a distributed build cluster outside Google. And there are efforts to change that. Google has a remote build execution offering. I've heard of some other startups trying to do it. I think the larger question of does it take everything over is, well, your constraints are different. Bazel requires a lot of strictness, and it offers a lot of benefit of being able to parallelize everything. That's great if your problem is slow builds. If your problem is I'm trying to get something up and running, I think it's very intolerant of hacks.
Yeah.
Whereas, lots of times, right, if you could make something 10x faster, but, 1 out of 1,000 times you have to reset it afterwards, that's probably worth it on most teams. And so I think Bazel is fantastic for what it is. And what it is a crystallization of the constraints and a specific set of trade-offs that made sense at Google in that 2005 to 2010 timeframe. Whereas now, builds are, in many cases, getting faster because binaries are getting smaller as they're becoming, if not microservices, at least, milliservices. So I think there's a lot of value to standardizing on a tool across a company, but the trade-offs that you have to make, I don't think it makes sense for every org to adopt Bazel. It still might be the case that everyone does because nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Who gets fired for copying Google?
Yeah. So after you left Google, you were at Twitter for a time. Can you talk about how the transition from Google to Twitter changed your perspective, if it did so, on developer tools?
Yeah, I think Google has developer tools kind of figured out, or at least they think they have them figured out. They have a perspective. Like Bazel is a hammer, and so things look like nails. They knew what they wanted development to look like, and in order to get closer to that, they needed to have a vision and to be able to break it down into, roadmaps of years that teams of dozens can work on. And the result has been incredibly effective towards that model. I think I kind of joined Twitter to think about different models. I feel like we've siloed into like source control versus build versus test and not gotten to the same point of, hey, what do I do as I'm editing? I just want it to be fast in this new world. I kind of joined Twitter to try some different stuff, and I wasn't there that long, but I think I learned a lot just technically in other ways. I was really impressed with how Twitter thought about functional programming in a distributed system, like not just at the level of what does this, definition of the factorial function look like, but actually how do we think about it? The paper, your server as a function is just amazing, and I think their models are so different. If you've been at one place for a long time, I highly encourage you to think about what you can learn from other places that just have other dogma. That was cool.
Yeah. Can you talk about how tilt began. So where did the idea and
Yeah.
inspiration come from, and when did you decide, hey, let's go all in on this?
Yeah. My then friend, now co-founder, Nick, and I had always talked about developer tools, and he was looking for a new adventure. And so we kind of set out, originally just the two of us, no company, just renting desks in a co-working space and exploring how cloud can help that inner loop developer experience. And there were a lot of ways we think it can. And we built an early iteration, an MVP of something we called live integration. So, like continuous integration, it runs your builds and tests, but it's live. So, actually, each time you save, we'd upload just the diff and run your builds and tests in the cloud in parallel in seconds. And technically, I'm super proud of it.
Wow.
But when we went out to market and to talk to people about it, the feedback we got was, yeah, I've had times where this has really been an issue for me, but nowadays I'm more dealing with container images and Kubernetes. And so we kind of realized that our vision that cloud can help the developer experience was running smack dab into the reality that cloud has already hurt the developer experience in all of the ways we talked about. So that really led us to throw that out, and we still have a repo with all of the code. I think there's some really impressive technical work there that I hope we'll get back to at some day. But for now, we're really just trying to get to this. How do we help people develop and on an individual cloud app? And then as we were talking about some of the multiplayer, how do you share that state and get better?
That makes sense. You talked a little bit about how the development environment got worse due to the shift to cloud. From where you stand, you've thought about this a lot. The dev environment, what things have gotten better and what things have gone awry over the past decade?
Oh yeah, I love that you ask the hard questions. I think IDEs have in lots of ways gotten so much better. There's I think just much better knowledge of how to jump to references, how to use that. I think and really it can depend what you mean by development environment specifically. I think people's use of Git has gotten a lot better, either because they have some wrappers that their companies use, but like people are more able to share things, and you're able to take a look at things more easily in web UIs. Where have things gone awry? I think I think one blog post that we maybe don't talk about that much anymore is the Joel test. Do you remember this at all?
The Joel test?
Yeah.
Like the 10 things that your software organization needs to do in order to be a good place to work? That one?
Yeah, exactly. That was posted in 2000, so 20 years ago. And I think if you go back and you revisit it, lots of things are really taken for granted now. Like, do you use source control? But I think, can you make a build in one step? Well, not
the
really.
Answer is no. It's almost never no. Or
Yeah.
It's never yes.
Yeah. And so I think like that's part of it, is how do you just come in one day? With a monolith, you didn't have to know what all libraries there were now, but now you hire someone to be a front-end engineer and suddenly they're having to also go to Kubernetes boot camp. That's not great. I think what's team configuration and what's individual configuration, there's something there that we've lost at least a little of in terms of how do different people set things up? How do they use it? IDEs, I saw a Twitter debate about is VS Code an IDE or not, because kind of IDEs originally were like, they're opinionated about everything. I'm not completely sure how I feel about it. I think, how do we make it that people are able to develop, they know what they can do? How often have you been looking over the shoulder of someone and you've been surprised by what they're able to do, or you're surprised by what they're not doing that you know how to do? I think that almost is like a meta response to your question of like, it's so individual what the developer experience is like, and that itself is a problem, that it's not easy to see what others do or learn from them, except when you happen to pair.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that people are talking about now is cloud IDEs, especially as a way to standardize the development environment. And
Yeah.
If I could be a little bit provocative here, I'd like to get your take on that trend. So,
Yeah.
from your perspective, are cloud IDEs a paradigm shift? Are we all going to be using them in 5 to 10 years, or are they a passing fad?
Yeah. So I think, one, I certainly have at least a bit of a conflict of interest here, which might make it, more interesting, might make it, less correct, might at least make it more provocative.
What is the conflict? Is it that Tilt is for local development?
I think it's like Tilt. I think the conflict is that we say we want to help move your development to the cloud, and we aren't starting with an IDE.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that? And I think it's because to us, there's the text that you edit, and how do you edit that? And we worked on Google Sheets and Google Docs, and so we kind of know what it's like to build an editor in web technologies.
Yeah.
We instead started not with the text that you're editing, but the workflows. Once you have, bytes saved in some file system on disk, what do you actually want to do with that? How do you know that they're the right words in some programming language? We think that unlike with documents like Google Docs, it's way less in that inner loop about what do other people think, which is what web collaboration makes easy, and way more about what are the workflows. Mm-hmm. And so Tilt, we want you to be able to use it and to use that to standardize your developer environment, whether you run it on your laptop talking to a cloud cluster, on your laptop talking to a cluster like Minikube, or like we said, Foreman, whether you're running it in a cloud VM talking to a cloud cluster. There are all these kinds of things, and I think almost a delamination occurring between web IDEs, between all IDEs really, and how they affect, with an E, how they operate is maybe less ambiguous, the workflows that you want to do. You're seeing with language server protocol, the IDE knows less about the language because it's farming that out to this language server. Mm-hmm. I think more of that has to happen with IDEs saying, hey, it's not about running this one binary or debugging this one binary. It's about what are the different workflows and what's the menu that's available. And we kind of think that Tilt's a great complement to that. And that, I don't know, I think about Gmail. Gmail really changed what webmail was like. But, nowadays, most people access Gmail through mobile apps. Mm-hmm. So how often do you really use the fact that you can get it from anywhere? And so, like, what ends up being, the key part of an idea or a change can reveal itself differently 10 years later. So I think that what's important is less I believe that we're going to figure out how to edit in a browser. And it's more, once you've edited in the browser, how do you know that's right? And I think the answer isn't just CI, because that's too slow. And GitHub has for years had this, you can go in and propose small edits just in the web.
Yeah.
But it's really, how do you make that fluent? And I think that the answer isn't going to be just, I happen to have a shell in some cloud VM, because you still have so much to get up to speed with to actually do interesting things like start your app or reseed the database. And so we want to fit into that with Tilt, because we think that otherwise it's just a bunch of using wiki pages to know which shell scripts to invoke with which args. We want to be a workflow engine that teams find so useful that it's the obvious answer for how to help new contributors contribute. And we'll kind of see what the popular UIs are to make the edits to the text, which is a huge problem, and which I think is why you're kind of seeing this separation between the IDE, what's the Chrome of it, and what and where do the workflows themselves happen.
In 10 years, do you think that you'll be using a Cloud IDE as your primary editor?
I'm embarrassed. I'm scared to admit this. I still
I can say my answer too, if that would help.
I still use Emacs.
Me too.
Excellent. Yeah. Which can be, quite the IDE, and, just has a level of, not just configurability, but customizability of how you can, put in your own workflows in a way that I haven't seen in other editors. It's so much to make an extension in VS Code, whereas in Emacs it's just some Lisp. But, will I even be programming in 10 years? I think of that quote of I don't know what the high performance programming language of 20 years ago from now will be like, but I know what it will be called, Fortran. There's kind of some things that are always constant, and even as they change, I don't know. And I'm frankly spending all my time thinking about, wherever you're typing something, how do you know it works? How do you know it works for others? How do you know what the problems are as quickly as possible? That's where I'm at in the stack.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another kind of trend or buzzword that we've seen lately is serverless. So yeah. AWS Lambda, Google Cloud Functions, Cloudflare Workers, and a bunch of other infrastructure providers are now offering people the ability to run code with minimal deployment configuration. First of all, do you see that becoming a big thing in terms of how people deploy software? And if so, how does Tilt fit into that picture?
Yeah, I think it's definitely becoming a big thing. The question is, does big mean 0.1%, which already is huge, or 1 or 10 or 50 or 90 or 99.9, right? I think that really Tilt, about being an engine that understands distributed systems and giving you a holistic view of it with the UI, you definitely want it in a situation with serverless where there are more pieces to think about, where, changing one thing, there's more nooks and crannies that can go wrong. If anything, it makes our job more essential and harder as you actually, think about, I'm not just changing this, one function in my CRUD app to save it, but what actually happens when I save it, and then my next serverless function reads that value. When there's problems across that, how do you deal with it? I think a lot of people don't know what's going to happen with Kubernetes. Will people use Kubernetes? Will they use their company's layer atop Kubernetes? Will they all use one common layer on top of Kubernetes? And I think that's a really interesting question that I don't know. And almost like with Tilt, what's important to us is that we're, help riding the freight train of Kubernetes, not trying to lay track in front of it, right? That we're not trying to do something that Kubernetes could. And I think, thankfully for us, the Kubernetes project is kind of clear about what the bounds are. Serverless, what do you want? It's difficult to figure out. I think of Git. Git has this idea of plumbing versus porcelain, that you could put different UIs. And by UI, I might mean a command line interface, but with different, verbs and on top of the Git internals. And none of those have taken off. Like, there's just something about having some interface and having it be common that makes it hard to build something on top of it. I think of Worse is Better, this amazing paper by Richard Gabriel about how kind of C and C++ and Unix are good enough. And he was this old Common Lisp hacker, Emacs person, to call back to our shared love, apparently. And he's kind of bemoaning, like, why aren't people rebelling that all they have is C and Unix? And he gets at, like, kind of what makes it such an effective virus to spread and be impossible to replace because it's wormed its way in. I don't know, and I think I'm kind of hedging my bets by trying to be in places where that doesn't matter. No matter what you use to deploy, you're going to have to think about the different functions you're writing, whether they're in one binary or 10 or 1500, to figure out what the overall app is. That's what I believe. That's all I have to believe to make something that really helps a bunch of people. And so what you're asking is kind of over the horizon for me, which might make me a less interesting podcast guest, but I hope makes me a more effective toolsmith.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. It sounds like what you're saying is, whatever happens on the ops side of things, whatever crazy new thing pops up the next 5 to 10 years, like microservices, nano services, millions of cloud functions, whatever, that's all going to happen. The people who make those are going to be really focused on the deployment environment, and Tilt, it sounds like, is going to be the company that takes all that and makes it so that developers don't go crazy with their development environment, because Lord knows things might get really bad if we continue down the road that we've been on.
I certainly hope so. That's what we're setting out to do. Yeah.
Awesome. And as kind of a final parting thought, if someone is listening to this and they're thinking to themselves, Tilt is something that sounds really neat, I want to try it out, how would one get started with it?
Yeah, go to tilt.dev and you can download it. There's lots of different content there for how to get it set up. Also throw out that I'm on Twitter at dbentley. You can always reach out to me. You can go to calendly.com/dbentley to schedule some time if you want to investigate it. I think if you're an app dev, Tilt can be a really good experience. Really, the most value is when teams are able to adopt it, and then they're able to take advantage of all of the hooks we have built in to help it proliferate across a team and be more effective. So if you're in that developer experience role, definitely reach out. We have a channel in the Kubernetes Slack for Tilt. It's all open source. You can download it. You can download the source. You can use it always for free. And we're there to help you figure out how.
My guest today has been Dan Bentley. Dan, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
The SourceGraph podcast is a production of SourceGraph, the universal code search engine, which gives you fast and expressive search over the world of code you care about. SourceGraph also provides code navigation abilities like jump to def and references in code review, and integrates seamlessly with your code host, whether you're working in open source or on a big, hairy enterprise code base. To learn more, visit sourcegraph.com. See you next time.